The man who walked into Rosie's diner wasn't looking for stew. He was looking for a ghost. He just didn't know the ghost was him. The town of Lone Hollow was where dreams came to die. You could feel it in the air, thin and sharp like a shard of glass. The wind didn't whistle through the hollow. It mourned, carrying dust from the bones of the mountain and the whispers of men who'd gone digging for silver and found only a grave. Every sign on every boarded-up shop was a tombstone. Darrell and Sons blacksmiths closed, mercantile, an empty rib cage behind dirty glass. Closed. The whole town was a funeral nobody had bothered to attend. And in the middle of it all was Merritt's Diner. It was the town's last stubborn heartbeat. Inside, Rosalind Rosie Byrne was wiping down a counter that had seen more sorrow than a church pew. Every night she did this. Every single night. She'd wipe away the coffee rings and the crumbs, but she could never wipe away the silence left behind by her husband, Henry. It had been 2 years since the Crescent Ridge mine had swallowed him whole. 2 years since the company sent her $50 and a letter of condolence that felt more like an invoice. The diner was their dream. Now it was just her anchor, the only thing keeping her from drifting away into grief. The sun was bleeding out over the mountains when the bell above the door chimed. It was a tired, lonely sound. Rosie froze. No one came to the diner after dark, not anymore. The men who used to fill these booths were either buried in the mountain or had drunk their way to another town, chasing another lie. He stepped inside and he brought the dusk in with him. He was tall, wrapped in a long coat the color of dried mud, and his hat was pulled down low, shadowing his face like a secret. He moved slow, deliberate, like a man who measured every step because he knew the ground beneath his feet could give way at any moment. He didn't look like trouble, but in Lone Hollow, trouble rarely bothered to knock. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was gravel, smoothed over by a politeness that didn't quite fit the dust on his boots. "Saw your light, wondering if a fella might get a bite to eat." Rosie's hand was resting just below the counter, near the old scattergun Henry had kept for emergencies. She looked at the man's hands. They were clean, calloused, but not cruel. He wasn't a gunslinger. He wasn't a thief. He was something else. Something she couldn't place. She nodded slowly. Was about to lock up. "I won't take long," he promised, taking off his hat. His hair was dark, shot through with silver at the temples. He had the kind of face that had seen too many sunrises from the wrong side of a long road. "Just a plate of whatever's warm, and coffee. If it's still hot." "Coffee's always hot," she said, her voice flat. She pointed to a booth by the window. "Sit where you like." He took the seat, his back to the wall, a man who was used to watching the door, smart or scared. Rosie moved to the stove without another word. She ladled a heavy scoop of beef stew into a bowl. It was the same stew she'd made yesterday, the same stew she'd been making for 2 years. It was Henry's favorite. She placed it in front of the stranger, along with a thick slice of cornbread and a steaming mug of black coffee. She didn't smile. She didn't ask his name. Out here, a name was a courtesy, not a right. She went back to her counter and pretended to clean, but she watched him in the reflection of the dark window. He ate like a man who'd forgotten what real food tasted like. Slow, appreciative. He didn't wolf it down like a hungry drifter. He savored it, as if every bite was a memory. He held the coffee mug with both hands, warming them, his eyes scanning the empty diner. He wasn't looking at the tables or the chairs. He was looking at the ghosts. And that's when Rosie felt the first chill crawl up her spine. This man wasn't just passing through. He was searching for something. "You from around here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. He looked up from his stew, his eyes dark and hard to read. "No, ma'am. Just passing through." A lie. It was a smooth lie, a practiced lie, but a lie all the same. She'd heard enough of them to know the texture. "Name?" she pressed. He paused. Just for a second. But a second was long enough. "Ellis," he said. "Folks call me Mr. Ellis." Another lie. This one was even heavier. A man who gives you a name like Mr. Ellis is a man who burned his real name long ago. Rosie just nodded. She didn't push. In the desert, you let a man keep his secrets. Sometimes it's all he has left. But she tucked it away. "Mr. Ellis." The man with no past and no destination? The man who ate her dead husband's stew like he was saying a prayer. When he was done, he pushed the bowl away and looked at her. That was the best stew I've had in 10 years. Either you've been eating dirt for 10 years or you're a flatterer, Mr. Ellis, she said, her tone sharp. A small smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. Maybe a little of both. He stood up, reached into his coat, and pulled out a leather pouch. The clink of coins was wrong. It was too heavy, too solid. Drifters carried pennies and wishes. This man carried silver dollars. He placed one on the counter. It gleamed under the lamplight. Stew and coffee's a quarter, she said, her eyes narrowing. Keep the change, he said, for the hospitality. Before she could argue, he was putting on his hat. Boarding house is 2 blocks west, she found herself saying, not sure why. Thank you, ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat. He paused at the door. You've got a fine place here, a place worth holding on to. And then he was gone. The bell chimed, and the silence rushed back in, colder than before. Rosie stared at the silver dollar. It felt heavy in her hand. Too heavy. It wasn't a payment. It was an apology. But what in God's name did a man like that have to be sorry for? She had no idea, but she was about to find out. The next night he came back. Same time. Same quiet footsteps. Same ghost sitting in the corner booth. Rosie's heart did a funny little jump in her chest, a mix of fear and something else she refused to name. She'd told herself he'd be gone by morning, just another shadow swallowed by the horizon. She was wrong. Figured I'd see if that stew was as good as I remembered, he said, taking off his hat. Rosie just nodded and went to the stove. She brought him his stew and his coffee, but this time something was different. She poured herself a mug and, against her better judgment, sat down at the other end of his table. The space between them felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. They ate in silence for a while. It wasn't awkward. It was heavy, weighed down by unspoken questions. You planning on staying in Lone Hollow long, Mr. Ellis? She finally asked. He stirred his coffee, watching the black liquid swirl. Not sure. Some places, they grab hold of you. Others, they can't wait to spit you out. Rosie looked out the window at the dying light. This town used to be a promise, she said, more to herself than to him. Now it's just a warning. His eyes found hers across the table. They were deep, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of pain in them. What changed? And just like that, the dam inside her broke. She didn't mean to tell him, a stranger, a liar, but the words came spilling out anyway, a flood of grief she'd held back for 2 long years. She told him about Henry. She told him about the mine, the Crescent Ridge mine, the jewel of Sinclair Holdings, the company that owned half of Nevada and all of Lone Hollow's soul. She told him how Henry was a good man, a careful man, how he'd complained for weeks about the bracing in Shaft 4, how he'd said the company was cutting corners, using green timber to save a few dollars. Management said it wasn't in the budget, she said, her voice tight, brittle. A week later, the whole shaft collapsed. 6 men. They didn't even get the bodies out, just sealed the mine. Called it a tragedy. Mr. Ellis had put his spoon down. His hands were flat on the table, his knuckles white. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the wood grain, as if he could see the faces of the dead men there. I'm sorry, he said, his voice so quiet she barely heard it. But she felt it. He meant it. The company sent me $50, she continued, a bitter taste in her mouth, and a letter, typed, said it was compensation for a man's life, $50. A long, heavy silence settled between them. The only sound was the wind scratching at the windows, trying to get in. Grief is a ghost, Mr. Ellis, she whispered. It sits at your table every night. It drinks your coffee. It never, ever leaves. He finally looked up. His face was a mask, but his eyes were shattered. I know what that's like, he said, his voice raw. You lose someone? She asked softly. He looked away. Not like you did, he said, but I lost something. A long time ago. Or maybe I sold it, and I never realized how much it was worth until it was gone. Rosie didn't know what to say. Here were two strangers, sitting in a dusty diner in a dying town, sharing their ghosts. He looked back at her, his gaze intense. You ever think of leaving? Starting over somewhere new? She shook her head. Henry's buried in that mountain. If I leave, who's left to remember he was even here? Who's left to be angry for him? The man across from her visibly flinched. He swallowed hard, a muscle twitching in his jaw. It was as if her words had struck him like a physical blow. He didn't know it yet. He couldn't possibly know. But her words weren't just words. They were a judgment, and they had just condemned him. He pushed his chair back and stood up, reaching for his coat. If I were buried somewhere, he said softly, I'd hope someone like you stayed behind to be angry for me. He placed another silver dollar on the table. You keep paying like that, I'm going to think you're made of money, she said, trying to lighten the mood. He gave her a strange, sad smile as he pulled his hat low. Let's just say I believe in paying my debts. Then he turned and walked out into the night. Rosie watched him go. Something had changed. The air in the diner felt different. It wasn't just her grief and her ghosts in here anymore. Now his were here too, and they were much, much darker than her own. His name wasn't Ellis. It was James Alton Sinclair. And he wasn't just passing through Lone Hollow, he owned it. Every dusty street, every boarded-up shop, every nail in every coffin. He had signed the papers. He had approved the budgets. He had read the reports. The town wasn't just a place on a map to him. It was an asset, a line item in a ledger book thick with the sins of commerce. The next morning, he walked the streets of his dying town. He wasn't James Sinclair, the tycoon from Virginia City who dined with senators and broke men with the stroke of a pen. He was Mr. Ellis, a drifter, a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own creation. He passed the old blacksmith's forge. The ledger had called it underperforming property. James remembered signing the foreclosure notice. He never knew the blacksmith, Darrell, had a family. He never knew Darrell would drink himself into an early grave after losing the only thing his father had ever given him. He passed the mercantile. Asset liquidation. That's what the paperwork said. He never knew the owner was a widow named Ellen Price who sold the deed to pay for a doctor for her sick child. The child died anyway. This wasn't business. This was a boneyard, and he was the one who had sold the shovels. He had come to Lone Hollow to see it for himself, to see what his empire was built on. He thought he was prepared. He thought he could look at it with the detached coldness that had made him rich. He was wrong. Seeing it was one thing. But meeting Rosie, that was another. Her grief wasn't a statistic. It was real. It had a face, and it served him stew every night. He was standing outside the tilted porch of the boarding house trying to light a cigarette with trembling hands when a voice cut through the morning chill. You should have worn a different coat, Sinclair. James froze. He turned slowly. Leaning against a hitching post was a wiry man with a scruffy beard and eyes that had seen too much. His clothes were ragged, but the revolver on his hip was clean and well-oiled. This wasn't a drifter. This was a man with a purpose. You've mistaken me for someone else, James said, his voice steady. The man pushed himself off the post and took a step closer. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. No mistake. I saw you in Virginia City, at the mining exchange. You were up on a stage talking about progress and profit, talking about how towns like this were the price of building a great nation. The man spat on the ground. My name is Silas. My brother, Jacob, worked at the Crescent Ridge. The cigarette fell from James's fingers. He was in Shaft 4, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. He used to write letters, told me about the cheap timber, told me the whole damn mountain was a death trap waiting to happen. He said a man named Sinclair was putting silver before souls. James felt the air go thin. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a reckoning. What do you want? James asked, his own voice sounding foreign to him. Silas's smile widened. What do you think I want? You walk into this town, the town you murdered, pretending to be some poor son of a bitch. You sit in Rosie Byrne's diner. Rosie. Henry Byrne was my brother's best friend. You think no one was going to notice you? James's mind was racing. He could deny it. He could fight. But what was the point? The man was right. You're a long way from your fancy office and your paid-off sheriffs, Silas hissed, his hand drifting down toward the butt of his pistol. Out here, a man like you can just, disappear. Another drifter who got lost in the desert. No one would even look for you. The threat hung in the air, sharp and cold. This wasn't about blackmail. This was about vengeance. James looked into Silas's eyes, and he didn't see a man who wanted money. He saw a man who wanted justice, the kind of justice that came from the barrel of a gun. You're right, James said quietly. I am who you say I am. And your brother, he was right about the mine. Silas blinked. He hadn't expected a confession. He had expected a fight, a denial, an arrogant dismissal. The honesty seemed to throw him off balance. James reached slowly into his coat. Silas's hand tensed on his gun, but James didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out his ledger, the small leather-bound book that held all his secrets. He opened it to the page for Crescent Ridge. He pointed to a line. This is the budget approval for the timber. My signature is at the bottom. He then flipped to another page. This is the accident report. It lists your brother Jacob as one of the deceased. He looked up, his eyes meeting Silas's. And this, he said, turning to the last entry, is the order to close the mine and acquire the surrounding land at a reduced rate. Also my signature. He held the book out to Silas. I can't bring your brother back, James said, his voice thick with a guilt so profound it was almost a physical thing. I can't undo what I did, but I came here to try and make it right, not with money, but with the truth. Silas stared at the open ledger, at the cold, hard proof of the decisions that had destroyed his family. He looked from the book to James's face. He saw no fear there, only a deep, soul-crushing weariness. The rage in Silas's eyes began to flicker. It was being replaced by a confused, bitter sorrow. Killing this man wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't bring Jacob back. It would just make another ghost in a town already full of them. He slowly shook his head and pushed the book away. You want to make it right? Silas whispered, his voice hoarse. You can't. But you're here, in the mud with the rest of us. Maybe that's a start. He looked down the street toward the diner. Don't you dare hurt her, Sinclair. She's all this town has left of a good heart. Silas turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. He didn't look back. James stood there for a long time, the cold wind whipping at his coat. He had faced down corporate raiders, armed union men, and hostile politicians. But he had never been more terrified than he was in that moment, because Silas hadn't tried to kill him. He had given him something far worse, a chance to live with what he'd done. That night James walked into the diner, and the weight of his real name felt like a shroud. Rosie was sitting at a table in the corner, not cleaning, not working, just sitting. An old worn letter was open in front of her. The lamplight softened the lines of grief on her face, and for a moment she just looked beautiful. She looked up as he entered. You're late, she said. Her voice was soft, no accusation, just a statement. Got held up, he said, walking over. He gestured to the letter. News from home? She gave a small, sad smile. Something like that. It's from Henry, the last one he ever wrote. James felt his blood run cold. He sat down opposite her, his hands suddenly feeling clumsy and useless. He wrote it the morning of the collapse, she said, her fingers tracing the faded ink. Said he had a bad feeling, a real bad feeling. He told me if anything happened, I should take the insurance money and buy the old stagecoach station south of town. Fix it up. He said Lone Hollow was going to grow, that people would need a place to rest their horses, get a hot meal. She looked up and her eyes were shining with unshed tears. He always had such big dreams, bigger than this town, bigger than his own life. James's throat was tight. The stagecoach station. He knew the one. It was a derelict wreck on a plot of land that Sinclair Holdings had bought for pennies on the dollar after they'd successfully lobbied to have the main stage route moved 20 miles to the north. Another small, cruel act of commerce that had choked the life out of a small dream. His act. He had signed that paper, too. You ever think about doing it? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Fixing it up? She let out a short, bitter laugh. On what? The diner barely keeps the lights on. The bank's been sending threatening letters. Besides, that land belongs to the Sinclair Company now. They'd want a fortune for it. She looked down at the letter, her expression turning fierce. But sometimes I let myself dream about it. A fresh coat of paint, a warm fire in the hearth, the sound of something other than the wind. James stared at her, at the raw, stubborn hope in her face. This woman who had lost everything was still capable of dreaming. And he was the man who had turned all her dreams into nightmares. You should have that, he said, the words torn from him. You deserve to have that. She looked at him, her head tilted. Why do you care so much, Mr. Ellis? You're just a drifter. He couldn't meet her eyes. He looked away, out the dark window. Because, he said, his voice cracking, maybe it's time someone started putting dreams back where they belong. There was a long pause. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall, measuring out the seconds of his stolen time. Dreams are expensive, Rosie said softly. James finally looked back at her, and the truth was afire in his eyes. So is guilt, he whispered. She stared at him, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. She didn't understand. Not yet. He stood up, placed his customary silver dollar on the table, and walked to the door. Good night, Mr. Ellis, she called after him. He paused with his hand on the knob. He wanted to turn around. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess, to beg, to burn his whole world down right there at her feet. But he couldn't, not yet. Good night, Rosie, he said. He had never used her first name before. The sound of it hung in the air between them as he stepped out into the cold, dark night. He had left more than $1 on the table. He had left a promise he had no idea how he was going to keep. The fuse had been lit. For 2 weeks, James became a fixture at the diner, but not as a customer. He became a handyman, a ghost in overalls. He showed up one morning with a toolbox he'd bought from the nearly bankrupt general store. He didn't ask. He just started working. He fixed the squeaky hinge on the back door. He patched the roof where the winter rains had left a dark stain on the ceiling. He replaced a cracked pane of glass in the kitchen window, silencing the mournful whistle of the wind that Rosie had lived with for 2 years. She watched him, a bemused, suspicious look on her face. You trying to work off a debt I don't know about, Mr. Ellis? She teased one afternoon, handing him a glass of water. He was on his knees wrestling with a leaky pipe under the sink. He looked up, his face smudged with grime, and he smiled, a real smile. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the shadows. Let's just say I'm better with my hands than I am with my words. And for the first time she laughed, a real deep, genuine laugh. The sound filled the empty diner, and it was the most beautiful thing James had ever heard. It was the sound of life in a place that had forgotten how. They fell into a routine, an easy, comfortable rhythm. They'd work, and then they'd eat lunch together, sitting on upturned crates behind the diner, the desert sun warm on their faces. They talked about everything and nothing, her childhood in Tennessee, a horse he'd once owned, the way the stars looked in the desert sky, so close you could almost touch them. He was careful. He never talked about his past, and she, in turn, never asked. She still called him Mr. Ellis, but the name was different now. It was a shield, yes, but it was one they were both holding up together, a shared secret, a fragile truce. James felt something happening to him, something he hadn't felt since he was a young man, before the money and the power had carved out his soul. He was happy. It was a quiet, terrifying kind of happiness, the kind that you know can't last. He was right. The man from the bank arrived on a Tuesday. He rode a fine horse and wore a suit that was too clean for Lone Hollow. His name was Percival Trent, and he had the smug, predatory smile of a wolf that had just cornered a lamb. He stepped onto the diner porch where Rosie was sweeping. Miss Byrne, he said, tipping his hat with a flourish that was meant to be condescending. A pleasure. Mr. Trent, Rosie said, her voice tight. She stopped sweeping. What do you want? Trent pulled a sheaf of papers from a leather satchel. Just a friendly reminder, he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. As per our last correspondence, the outstanding balance on your loan is due to be paid in full. You have 21 days. He let the number hang in the air. after which the First Nevada Bank of Carson County will be forced to take possession of this establishment. He glanced around the diner with a look of distaste. I hear there's a gentleman in Reno looking to open a new line of gambling parlors. This place has good bones. For a card room. James had been inside, fixing a loose floorboard. He heard every word. He stood up and walked to the door, a hammer still hanging from his hand. Is there a problem here? He asked. His voice was quiet, but it had a core of steel that made Trent take an involuntary step back. The banker looked James up and down, taking in the dusty clothes and the grime on his hands. I don't believe I'm speaking to you, sir. You are now, James said, stepping out onto the porch. He was taller than Trent, broader. He didn't move, but the air around him crackled with menace. Rosie stepped between them. It's all right, Mr. Ellis. He's just doing his job. Indeed, Trent said, regaining his composure. He gave Rosie another oily smile. 21 days, Miss Byrne. I suggest you use them wisely. He tipped his hat again, shot James a contemptuous look, and walked away, his shiny boots clicking on the dusty boardwalk. A countdown to destruction. James watched him go, his hands clenched so tight the head of the hammer dug into his palm. Rosie turned and went back inside without a word. James followed her. He found her standing by the counter staring at the foreclosure notice. Her shoulders were slumped. The fight had gone out of her. How much? He asked quietly. She didn't look at him. Too much, she whispered. How much, Rosie? He pressed. She finally looked at him, her eyes full of a proud, desperate pain. $202. It was a fortune to her. To him, it was nothing, a rounding error in his weekly accounts. He could pay it without even thinking about it. I can help, he said. Her head snapped up. No, it's not charity, he said quickly. It's a loan. You can pay me back when you're on your feet. I have been on my feet for 2 years, she said, her voice shaking with a fury born of pride and fear. I buried my husband. I've kept this place running on my own. I won't lose it now, but I won't be saved by a man with no name and a pocket full of secrets either. I won't take your pity. Her words were a slap in the face. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't pity. It was guilt. It was a desperate, selfish need to fix one tiny piece of the world he had so thoroughly broken. But he couldn't. He just nodded. All right, he said softly. But the offer stands. He left the diner that night with a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He knew something Rosie didn't. The First Nevada Bank of Carson County. He owned a controlling interest. He had for 5 years. Percival Trent wasn't just a banker doing his job. He was James's employee. The foreclosure notice wasn't just a random act of a cruel economy. It was a direct consequence of the very system he had created. The monster he built was now coming to devour the one good thing he had found in his empty life. And he was the only one who could stop it. But to stop it, he would have to kill Mr. Ellis for good. He would have to become James Sinclair again. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the moment Rosie found out who he really was, she would hate him more than she hated the company that killed her husband. Because he was the company. He was the man who had signed Henry Byrne's death warrant, and she was the woman he was, impossibly, terrifyingly falling in love with. The confession was a loaded gun, and he had to point it at his own heart. He stood in front of the small warped mirror in his room at the boarding house. He wasn't wearing the dusty clothes of Mr. Ellis. He was wearing his own. A clean, crisp shirt, a tailored waistcoat, the clothes of James Sinclair, the clothes of a stranger, of an executioner. In his pocket was a bank draft. It was for $300. More than enough to pay off the loan. It was drawn on an anonymous account, untraceable. He could give it to her. He could save the diner and just ride away, disappear. Let her go on believing Mr. Ellis was a kind drifter who had helped her in her time of need. It would be the easy way out. It would also be the biggest lie of all. She deserved the truth, no matter how ugly it was, no matter if it destroyed them both. He walked to the diner as the sun set, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. Each step was a step toward his own damnation. He opened the door. The bell chimed. It sounded like a funeral toll. Rosie was at the counter, polishing glasses. She looked up and saw him, and for a second, she didn't recognize him. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Mr. Ellis?" she said, her voice uncertain. He didn't return her tentative smile. "Rosie, we need to talk." The tone of his voice made her put the glass down. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes searching his face. "What is it? What's wrong?" He walked to the counter, took the envelope with the bank draft out of his pocket, and laid it gently on the polished wood. She stared at it. "What is this?" "It's the money for the bank," he said. "It's yours. Take it. Save the diner." Her eyes flickered from the envelope to his face. The confusion was turning to suspicion. "Where did you get this kind of money?" "Mr. Ellis, what is going on?" He took a deep breath. This was it, the point of no return. "My name isn't Ellis," he said. The words felt like stones in his mouth. "It's Sinclair. James Alden Sinclair." Silence. A deep, profound, suffocating silence. The name just hung there in the air between them, a toxic cloud. She just stared at him. She blinked once, then twice. Her face went pale. All the color drained out of it, leaving it looking like a fragile porcelain mask. "Sinclair," she repeated. Her voice was a bare whisper. The name of the company, the name of the mine, the name of her husband's killer. He nodded, unable to speak. Her eyes, wide with a dawning, sickening horror, searched his. She was looking for the lie, praying for it. You own Crescent Ridge," she stammered. "Yes," he said. "My company does." She took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. A small wounded sound escaped her lips. "You knew," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All this time, you knew about Henry. You sat here, you ate my food." "Not at first," he said, his own voice desperate. "I swear, Rosie, I didn't know he was your husband until you showed me the letter. I knew about the accident, but I didn't know the names. To me, they were just numbers." The word hung in the air, damning him more than any lie could. Numbers. A terrible, bitter laugh escaped her. It was a sound of pure agony. "Numbers," she repeated. "My husband, my whole life. Just a number on one of your ledgers." Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and angry. "So this was all a game? Coming here? Fixing my roof? Was this some kind of sick penance? Did you want me to forgive you so you could sleep at night?" "No," he said, taking a step toward her. "Rosie, please." "Don't you say my name!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "You don't have the right to say his name. You don't have the right to say mine. Get out! Rosie! Get out!" Her voice was a raw, broken thing, the sound of a heart being shattered into a million pieces. He looked at her, at the woman he had so completely and utterly destroyed. There were no more words, no more apologies that could ever be enough. He slowly nodded, turned, and walked out of the diner. The door swung shut behind him, the chime of the bell mocking the ruin he left in his wake. Rosie stood there, trembling, her body racked with sobs. She looked at the envelope on the counter. The money that could save her diner. Blood money. With a cry of rage and grief, she swept it off the counter. It fluttered to the floor, a worthless piece of paper in the ruins of her life. The ghost in her diner finally had a name, and it was the devil himself. For 3 days, Lone Hollow held its breath. The tall stranger was gone. The diner was open, but the light inside seemed dimmer. Rosie moved like a phantom, her eyes hollow, her smile gone. The whole town could feel it. A storm was coming, and then it broke. The sky tore open, unleashing a torrent of rain so violent it felt like the heavens were trying to wash the town off the face of the earth. The wind howled like a banshee, and the streets turned to rivers of mud. And through the deluge, he rode back into town. James Sinclair. He wasn't Mr. Ellis anymore. He was soaked to the bone, his fine clothes ruined. But he sat tall in the saddle, his face set like granite. He didn't ride to the diner. He rode to the bank. He stormed through the doors, dripping water and fury onto the polished floor. Percival Trent looked up from his desk, his jaw dropping. "Mr. Sinclair, what on earth?" James didn't say a word. He strode to the desk and dropped a heavy, sodden leather folio onto it. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet bank. "What is this?" Trent stammered, fumbling with the clasp. "That," James said, his voice a low rumble of thunder, "is the end of Sinclair Holdings in Lone Hollow." Trent's face went white as he pulled out the documents. Deeds, titles, mortgage releases. "I'm dissolving the company's assets in this territory," James stated flatly. "I'm signing every property deed, every business loan, every plot of land over to the people who live here. Free and clear." Trent looked like he was going to faint. "But, sir, that's millions of dollars." "It's not dollars, Trent," James snarled, leaning over the desk until they were nose to nose. "It's blood. It's lives. It's everything this company has sucked out of this place, and I am putting it back." He tossed another sealed document on the desk. "That establishes a town council. The deeds will be held in a trust, managed by them, not by the state, not by the county, and not by me. This town will belong to itself." He straightened up, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "You work for them now, Trent, or I suggest you be on the next train out of Nevada, because as of this moment, my authority here is gone." He turned and walked out of the bank without a backward glance, leaving Percival Trent sputtering in the midst of the ruins of his cushy, predatory world. That night, a miracle happened in Lone Hollow. It started as a rumor, a whisper carried on the wind. Then the proof began to arrive. A young boy sent by a terrified-looking Trent went door to door delivering envelopes. Inside, people found their own miracles. The deed to their house, stamped, paid in full. The mortgage on their business, canceled. A letter informing them that their outstanding debts at the general store had been erased. The town, a place that had been suffocating under the boot of debt for a decade, could suddenly breathe again. People stood on their porches in the pouring rain, holding the papers in their hands, weeping with a joy they had forgotten how to feel. Rosie heard the commotion. She saw her neighbors celebrating, hugging, laughing through their tears. She didn't understand. Then the boy knocked on her door. He handed her an envelope and ran off before she could say a word. Inside wasn't a mortgage release. She owned the diner outright, a gift from Henry. Inside was a deed to a small plot of land south of town, a plot with an old abandoned building on it, the old stagecoach station. Her name was on the title, Rosalind Byrne, clean and clear, and underneath it was a letter. She took it inside, her hands shaking so badly she could barely break the seal. The ink was slightly smeared from the rain, but the words were clear. "Rosie, I know this doesn't fix it. Nothing can. I don't want your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But Henry had a dream for you, and men like me should not have the power to kill a good man's dream. The station is yours. The town is yours. All of it. It's all I can give back. I'm leaving. I won't come back. But please, for Henry's sake, build that porch. Put a fire in the hearth. Let his dream live, even if he can't. James." She read the letter once, twice. The paper trembled in her hand. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She put on her coat, walked out into the storm, and started walking south. She found him at the station. The place was a wreck, half its roof caved in, but he had managed to start a small, sputtering fire inside one of the old horse stalls. He was sitting on the damp earth, staring into the flames, a man who had given away an empire and was now left with nothing but the ashes. He looked up when she stepped through the ruined doorway, a silhouette against the raging storm. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Her hair was plastered to her face, her coat soaked through. She was shaking, but not from the cold. "You think this makes it even?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "You think you can just buy this town a clean conscience and ride away?" He slowly got to his feet. He looked wretched, beaten. "No," he said softly. "I told you, it's not about forgiveness." "Then what is it about?" she demanded, taking a step closer. "What do you want from me? From this place?" "I want you to have what you deserve," he said, his voice cracking. "I want one good thing to rise from all the wrong I've done." She stared at him, the rain and the firelight dancing in her eyes. She saw the tycoon. She saw the liar. She saw the man who had sat at her table and listened to her pour out her heart. She saw the man who had fixed her roof, and she saw something else. A man as broken as she was. A man drowning in a different kind of grief. Henry wasn't a number, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He was a good man. He loved this town. He believed in it, even when it was dying. I know, James whispered back. She held up the deed, the paper limp and damp in her hand. He wanted to build something here, she said. Not just for us, for everyone. He believed in second chances. She took a deep breath, the cold, wet air filling her lungs. I'm not sure if I do. Not for you, not yet. James just nodded. He understood. He expected nothing less. But, she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, I also know that a man who runs from his ghost can't ever build anything. He just leaves more ruins behind. She looked around the dilapidated station, at the broken walls and the leaking roof. This place needs a lot of work, she said. It's too much for one person. She turned her gaze back to him, an unspoken challenge, a question, a sliver of hope, as fragile as a spider's thread, hanging in the stormy air. You can stay, she said, her voice firm. You can help me build it. No more lies, no more secrets. You work, you earn your place here, not as Sinclair, not as Ellis, as James. And we'll see. We'll just see. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But the look in his eyes was answer enough. The gratitude, the disbelief, the faintest flicker of a light coming back on in a place that had been dark for a very, very long time. Rosie turned and walked back out into the rain, leaving him standing in the ruins. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. She had left the door open. And for the first time in a long time, so had the sky. The rain was starting to soften. The storm was passing. And in Lone Hollow, something new and fragile and brave was about to begin. The first snow of winter came softly, a quiet promise whispered across the land. It dusted the peaks of the mountains and settled in the ruts of the road leading to the old stage station. The station wasn't a ruin anymore. It had a new roof. The walls were patched and solid. The windows had glass. A curl of smoke rose from a sturdy new chimney, a warm, welcoming beacon against the cold. James sat on the new porch he had built with his own two hands. His hands were calloused and scarred now, the hands of a carpenter, not a tycoon. He watched the snowflakes melt on the raw wood of the steps, a blanket draped over his shoulders. He had worked every day since the storm, sunup to sundown. He hauled timber. He drove nails. He learned the language of saws and hammers. Some of the men from town, the ones whose homes he had inadvertently saved, had started to come out and help. First Silas, his brother's memory a silent, driving force between them. Then others. They didn't talk about the past. They just worked. Together they were building something. He didn't know if Rosie would ever truly forgive him. He didn't ask her to. It was enough that she let him try to earn his way back into the light. She would come out sometimes, bringing coffee and sandwiches, and watch them work. Her eyes were still guarded, but the anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful curiosity. The sun was setting, turning the snow-kissed valley a soft shade of rose gold, when he heard her footsteps. She came over the rise, wrapped in a thick wool coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She was carrying a large wicker basket. She walked right up the steps, past him, and set the basket on the bench beside him. She didn't say a word. She just lifted the cloth lid. The smell of roast chicken, biscuits, and molasses-baked carrots filled the cold air. She sat down, pulled a thermos from the basket, and poured 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to him. Their fingers brushed. It was the first time they had touched since the night he had told her his name. He looked at her, his heart in his throat, but she was just looking out at the valley. Figured the whole county could probably wait, she said, her voice soft. But supper can't. A slow smile spread across James's face. It felt as new and strange as the calluses on his hands. That's the best thing I've heard all year, he said. They ate in a comfortable silence. The only sounds the crunch of snow under the feet of a passing deer and the crackle of the fire from inside. They didn't talk about forgiveness. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about the price of lumber. They talked about whether the new schoolhouse would need a second wood stove before the deep winter set in. He told her he was thinking of buying a team of horses for the station once the barn was finished. She told him she wanted a swing on the porch, one that faced west so she could watch the sunset. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't absolution. It was something quieter, stronger, and more real. It was two broken people, sitting on a porch they had built from the ruins of their past, deciding to build a future. It was the slow, patient, painstaking work of putting things back together. It was a beginning, and in the quiet cold of the Nevada evening, under a sky full of new fallen stars, it was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story of redemption in the Old West, and you believe that a person's true measure is found not in the mistakes they make, but in how they work to fix them, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because there are a million stories buried out in the dust, just waiting to be told, and we're going to tell every single one of them.